Welcome to the AIER's Authors Corners podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Yang, and today we have our guest today is Eamonn Butler, who's the co-founder and director of the Adam Smith Institute, which is located all across the way in England. Today we'll be talking about his book, Entrepreneurship, a primer, which is a joint venture between us here at AIER and the Institute for Economic Affairs over in Europe. So, Eamonn, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you, despite lockdown and all of that kind of stuff, but still cheerful.
Of course. And thank you for joining us today. So, just a little bit about your background and the Adam Smith Institute, which I understand is a very important institution back in England. Maybe our listeners here in America may not be as informed. From my understanding, you guys actually had a very large role in advising the Thatcher government in its radical market reforms to English society. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yes. Colleagues and I started the Institute more than. And in the late 1970s, mid 1970s, in the UK, 40% of the workforce were government employees. A third of the housing was owned by government. The utilities, transport, manufacturing, all of the big industries were government monopolies. And of course, you had monopoly unions as well. And they just would insist on getting more and more money out of the government. And eventually the government in the mid-1970s went bust and it had to go to the IMF for a bailout. And it all culminated in 1978 in the so-called winter of discontent, where the unions demanded more money, the government said it couldn't pay. And so all of these big industries simply shut down. The whole country shut down, basically. And that led to the election of Mrs. Thatcher, because we all knew that we couldn't go on like that anymore. And she tried to reform things in a piecemeal sort of fashion. But we soon realized, we'd read R. Friedman and R. Hayek, and we soon realized that you actually had to get rid of all of these things and undertake a mass privatization strategy. And that's what we did. And we were really, I suppose, very upstream. We set designed the model for several of these privatizations, because it's not easy to privatize an industry. There's a lot of interest groups you need to take account of. And so we were really policy engineers, I think we'd call ourselves. I mean, people like the AIER, we think of as scientists, and we take the science and just say, right, well, how can we use that science to build a bridge? And that's really what we do in the policy world.
And that's certainly a remarkable story about England. I'm pretty sure here in the US, we can maybe take a warning from what happened there. But let's get right into your book. So if you guys can see that, this is a painting of Diogenes. It's a Greek philosopher who lived in a barrel, talking to Alexander the Great. And obviously at the end of your book, you tie it all into what this has to do with entrepreneurship. But can you explain just a little bit what the painting on this book represents, and then what does that have to do with markets and entrepreneurship?
Yes, well, it's the old ancient Greek story that Alexander the Great, who of course conquered the known world at the age of 32, visited his great hero Diogenes, the Cynic philosopher. And Diogenes rejected all of the benefits of the world and lived in a barrel. And so Alexander came up to him and said, great Diogenes, what can I, Alexander, with all of my wealth and armies, what can I do for you? And Diogenes said, can you stand out of the sunlight? And my point is that that's exactly what government should be doing if they want to encourage entrepreneurship, because they get in the way and they darken the outlook with the thick black ink of regulations and tax codes, and they make it almost impossible for entrepreneurs. So they should stand out of the sun and let entrepreneurship blossom.
And when it comes to entrepreneurs, the way we look at economics, especially in academia and the way it's taught in the classrooms, economics is this very mathematical, very rigid way of thinking about things. But in especially in Austrian economics, the type of economics that we tend to study here at AIER, entrepreneurs are very important to these market processes and they accomplish a lot of important goals. But I think the average American or the average Briton might think of entrepreneurs like running a lemonade stand, but obviously it's far more important than that. So can you explain the roles of entrepreneurs in society and just how important are these processes?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the entrepreneurship is overlooked by most of the economics textbooks. Textbooks talk about the firm, but they don't talk about why firms are created. They don't talk about why firms disappear. They don't talk about the nature of firms. The only thing they just talk about really is the size of firms. That's the only way in which they divide all of these different enterprises. You've got millions and millions of small firms and medium firms and large firms on the planet, and economics theory hasn't really got to grips with that. So there's no explanation of the human element. And this is, as you say, with the Austrian school, very interested in the human element in economics, because it's the human beings that actually drive the economy. And it's not about numbers and statistics, it's about individuals taking action. And so those human motives are essential to understanding economic life. And it seems to me that what we think about as factors of production, land, labor, capital, these are just dead things. They don't do anything. They don't create anything. They don't achieve anything unless they're actually directed by some human mind. You need somebody to put that land, labor, and capital together in a unique combination to make something that's new and different and better, and add to human prosperity and progress in the process. So entrepreneurs, that's what the entrepreneur does, and it's a very important role, and it's a role which is simply overlooked by the textbooks. So I call entrepreneurs the unseen factor of production, and it's very easy to talk, to draw supply and demand curves and to talk about perfect competition, and all these things are easy to understand. It's much more difficult to understand what markets are really about, because markets are dynamic. They keep on changing. Gaps open up and then people fill them with products or processes. And entrepreneurs are the people who seek out the gaps and fill them. And make the market work. The market wouldn't work if it was perfect. It only works because there are gaps and inconsistencies in it, which the entrepreneurs can seek out and make money from filling, but also benefit customers in the process. So that's a kind of, as Hayek called it, a discovery procedure, and that's what drives progress. So entrepreneurs are extremely important in doing that.
And I think, at least from my observation, omitting entrepreneurship from the way we look at economics, for example, and I think it paves the way for more central planning ideologies, like, for example, like Keynesianism might view the economy more so through these mathematical models, and therefore gives way to these central planning ideas. But entrepreneurship, for it to flourish, markets must be free, the governments must get out of the way. So can you maybe talk about the relationship between economic freedom and just allowing society to prosper and progress in this manner?
Well, I think you're quite right, and I'm much opposed to the mathematical strain in economics. Clearly it has a value in some circumstances, but I think one of the problems is that it makes you think that you know more than you actually do, and you put a mathematical formula on something, and you say, "Oh, well, that proves that this is the way the economy works, that if you do X, then the housing supply will do Y, and national income will do Z, and so on." And you plug it into a formula, and then you get this result. You plug in another value, and you get another result. And you think, well, that's obviously how things work. But then something comes out of the blue. There's I don't know, there's a COVID epidemic or there's a financial crash, which nobody seems to have predicted. And then all of your assumptions are up in the air. So yes, I think it's a very dangerous strategy. And as you say, it does make you think we can be technocratic about the economy. Economists have dreamed of this, ever since the 19th century. They've looked at physics in particular, but also chemistry and other natural sciences, and say, well, if only we could discover the laws of economics, then we can run the whole thing, you see, and we can plan it and make it better than it is at the moment in this sort of random, unplanned way. And of course, what happens is you quickly find that doesn't work. And when you do try it, when you do try central planning and you think you know it all and you collect all the information that you can and you direct production in ways that you think best, you discover that other people who don't do any of those things, just let ordinary people get on with their lives, that they actually progress very much more quickly. It's, the famous story of, well, I think it must have been Khrushchev visiting, and they went to New York, and Khrushchev asked him, who was in charge of food distribution in New York? Because it's so amazing. And Nixon said, well, nobody. You don't need central planning. What you need is millions and millions of individual planners, and they will get the job done. So yes, it's a deficiency of technical mathematical economics. And I think that's why, again, we should focus on entrepreneurs, we should focus on individuals, we should focus on human motives and values.
And in your book, you make a big point that entrepreneurs, they're usually a positive force. They serve a very important role in society, making these new products, solving market inefficiencies. But there's also bad entrepreneurship. People who seek out subsidies from the government that create really complicated political tools to manipulate the market in their favor. So can you talk about these sort of bad entrepreneurs and how damaging they are for the rest of society?
Well, there is unproductive. I mean, most of what we think of as being entrepreneurship is productive. It creates value, introducing new products, processes, benefiting customers. That's all very positive. There is a kind of entrepreneurship which doesn't create value, and there are kinds of entrepreneurship that actually destroy value as well. For example, I suppose internet scams. Now, internet scammers are very entrepreneurial. I mean, they change their tactics all the time. I nearly got caught the other day with something that looked as if it had come from my bank. They're very inventive, very entrepreneurial, but the relationship between them and me or whoever they try to scam is not a voluntary one. I don't enter into a contract in order to be robbed of my money and my possessions. That is something which destroys value. It doesn't create value, it steals value. And as such, the more of that you have, the less people are inclined to create value, because they know, well, it's just going to be stolen if we don't watch it. But there are other things, like one thinks about, well, health insurance, for example. It's a good thing in many ways, but it encourages doctors to enter into a sort of unholy alliance with patients and prescribe more and more tests, because that some third party is going to be paying. So that, again, is unproductive, and it puts patients through tests that they don't need to go through, and it adds costs to insurance companies, which means that those costs are passed on to other customers. So that's not productive. High-end complicated taxes are another problem, which have spawned a vast entrepreneurial industry of tax advisors. But I think most of it is unnecessary. If taxes were a lot fewer and a lot simpler, then people wouldn't even bother to, and a lot lower, then people wouldn't actually bother to avoid them. And that's the benefit of a flat tax, for example. You don't really just get rid of all these exemptions and complications, and you have a flat tax, and everybody knows what they're to pay, and they get on and they pay it. And if it's low enough, it's not worth avoiding. So there's no point in hiring smart accountants to put your money into other countries or move it around or whatever, or call it something that it isn't in order to avoid the tax. So onerous employment regulation does the same. You know, how can I fire somebody without going through all of these mechanisms that are laid down by regulation? So I think laws, regulations, and subsidies, they do all of that, but they also promote lobbying. Again, you know, lobbyists are very entrepreneurial. They're extremely good at what they do, and they get to legislators, and they work out all sorts of ways to get favors and benefits out of them. But it's not productive. It's, if anything, it's destructive.
And in your book, you talk about you talk about how, you know, in the European governments, they understand that entrepreneurship is good, but then they come up with this idea that maybe the state can promote more entrepreneurship. Maybe we can take taxpayer dollars and promote different types of entrepreneurship that we believe is productive. But at the end of the day, that came and fell flat on its face because entrepreneurship is it's a natural phenomenon. It's not a centrally planned phenomenon. So can you talk about these recent efforts to have essentially what state planned entrepreneurship, and what happened and why did it fail?
Well, I mean, just here in Europe, where we in Britain are no part of the European Union these days. We've left, but nevertheless, when we were in the Union in 2002, the European Union leadership promised that it was going to make the European Union the most dynamic, knowledge-based economy in the world. But of course, it didn't do the things that you need to achieve that. There were no changes to trade and commerce. There was no reduction of licensing restrictions that would keep out potential new players, market entrants. No reduction in employment laws that don't allow people to hire people except on very large minimum wages, and which don't allow you to fire people if things don't work out. And if you're an entrepreneur, you try lots of different things, and most of them won't work out. So you can't try things if you're locked into having lots and lots of employees on your books, and you can't fire them. So that experiment in making Europe the most dynamic knowledge economy in the world is, I put it to you, an abject failure. It's very far from, Europe is very far from that, you know, particularly because it doesn't have a kind of permissive culture. You have to have a law passed in your favor in order to do anything, rather than the sort of American culture where you just do things and there's only a law against it if it's a problem. And again, you know, the European Union again wanted to promote entrepreneurship by upping its expenditure on research and development. But again, research and development has actually only a very faint relationship with entrepreneurship, and that didn't work either. And then many other countries in the world have given grants to small companies, thinking that the point you made earlier, that small companies are entrepreneurial. Well, you know, they're not. The corner shop is not necessarily entrepreneurial. McDonald's wasn't entrepreneurial until it was taken over by, is it Frank Kroc, who, you know, worked out how to make it a much more business-like enterprise. And how to do it on a big scale. That's entrepreneurship, but a small local shop or bakery is not. So giving grants to those sorts of enterprises just isn't going to improve entrepreneurship. A lot of countries do that. Many countries have tried to emulate the success of Silicon Valley. France, for example, tried to do it, and all that happened is it wasted vast fortunes of taxpayer money and didn't actually produce anything that was anything like Silicon Valley. I'm actually speaking from Cambridge, which is a sort of Silicon Valley in England, and that's not brought forward by government initiative at all. It's just a hub around the university, and then entrepreneurs and inventors started to accumulate, and the thing has got a life of its own. Other Middle East countries have tried to replicate the success of Dubai with its free ports, for example, and none of them have really succeeded. So these things are something that I think if you create the right conditions, then entrepreneurship will come forward. But it's not something that you can dictate and bring into life purposefully.
And I don't know if you know about the work of there's an Italian, I think she might be a neo-Keynesian, like her last name is Mazzucato. She has this whole like entrepreneurial state. I think she wrote the entrepreneurial state book, basically saying that the government must have like a direction, must impose directionality on society. Um, what do you think would be what is the intellectual opposition to that from the entrepreneurial perspective? And do you think her thesis sounds almost like a soft step in the direction of where England was before in the 1970s, before the Thatcher government?
Well, I think that her thinking comes, I think it's very largely informed by Silicon Valley. And it is true that in Silicon Valley, you had a lot of government spending, particularly on defense and security research, things like that. And that is what she thinks, well, that is what created Silicon Valley, and it was basically created on a government initiative. And in fact, all of the things that have come out of that, and the government created the internet and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but, who created the iPhone, and who created the millions of applications that you have on your iPhone? You can do anything you like, and entire warehouses of dictionaries and train timetables and airline timetables and everything else, and compasses and radios. It's all in your pocket. Now, the government didn't do that. So, it may be that the government investment can start something going, but it's actually the diversity and competition of lots of different entrepreneurs who actually get things done and actually produce the products that will promote progress into the future.
And in your book, you speak pretty highly of the entrepreneurial spirit and regulations of the US. You talk about permissionless innovation. And I guess obviously living in the US, we're always complaining about everything that's going on here. But it looks like, compared to Europe and especially compared to the rest of the world, the US, I guess, is still, at least in your book, you say it's still, the pinnacle entrepreneurship. It's still very productive. So what do we do different? Like, what should people here in the US understand that makes us different? Why are we so entrepreneurial? Why do we produce more, invent more than what seems the rest of the world is doing?
Well, a lot of people are puzzled on this. Some people say some people think it's education, because the world's top universities are either in Britain or in America. That's true of the top 40 universities in the world. But there seems to be little link between university and entrepreneurship. In fact, it's almost the opposite, because all the people you can think of, like, I don't know, Steve Jobs and so, and Bill Gates, these are people who've actually dropped out of university or never went to college in the first place. And college makes people risk averse somehow. And that in an entrepreneur is a bad idea. So there's no real link there. It could be that America has a huge market of many hundreds of millions of people. But again, the EU has an even bigger internal market, and that doesn't seem to be terribly entrepreneurial. I think the answer actually is a combination of many things. I think it's access to capital. Yes, America is a rich country, and if you want to start a business, your family has probably got some spare cash that they can lend you to help you start a business. It's got a very active banking sector. You can go to the bank and you can borrow. So access to capital, I think, is quite important. Freedom of innovation is, and indeed of action, is important. America always scores towards the top of the economic freedom of the world indexes, as do other places like Singapore, which is also highly entrepreneurial, and has become very rich. I think you also have, I mentioned it before, permissionless innovation, unlike here in the European Union. We have in the European Union a kind of Napoleonic law, which is that you really have to ask permission before you can do anything. In England and America, we have exactly the opposite, that it's assumed that you can do whatever you like, and you get on and you do it. And if there's a problem, only then do we start taking you to court and passing laws and doing things like that. So permissionless innovation is actually extremely important, because it's very good for entrepreneurships, because they know they can try new things without being loaded down by bureaucracy. And I think America, maybe despite recent years, what you might think, still has a very open culture, welcoming new people, but also welcoming new ideas in particular. It's a very keen on ideas, and I think so many in Europe are sort of not invented here types. And I think also Americans admire risk takers, and they allow them to fail. They don't mind people who try and fail. They don't get stigmatized as they do in some other countries. And so that again is important, because again, most entrepreneurs have several failures. Even richest man in the world, who runs Amazon, has had a number of failures. Amazon ran at a loss for years and years. He tried going into financial services and so on. That was a mistake. Other distribution mechanisms, those were mistakes. You have a lot of mistakes before you finally break through, and that's a very common story. So allowing people to take risks and make mistakes, I think, is important. But you also do have, by world standards, pretty low taxes. And that's very important for entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurs are taking a risk when they start a new business, and taxes simply add to that risk. And it means that, well, you think, well, I have to make even more money just to pay the tax. I'm not even going to bother. So in many countries, people just don't bother because the taxes are too high. And your regulation is relatively limited. I mean, I was in, before the virus struck, I was in Nepal, and it turns out that to run a small shop in Nepal, you need 23 different kinds of license, now from different ministries. Now, of course, nobody running a little corner shop has 23 different types of licenses. They're not going to waste the time and the money doing that. And then, of course, that then opens them up to corruption, because police and inspectors come around and say, well, we want to see your 23 licenses. And you say, well, I've only got 3. And they say, oh, well, for a small amount of money, I might look the other way. So you get corruption, which you don't get really at all in America. You don't get it in UK either. Nothing like the same as in many other countries. And I think ultimately you've also got a commitment to property, honesty, justice, the rule of law. These sort of liberal values are extremely important in promoting entrepreneurship, and indeed promoting markets. You have to trust people to operate markets, and all of those things help you to trust.
And I'd just like to ask one closing question to wrap this all up. Feel free to use this as either words of encouragement or words of warning, depending on how you feel about this question. But I was just wondering what you think is the current climate going forward when it comes to the acceptance of these, this intellectual tradition surrounding entrepreneurship and risk taking, and this ordered productive chaos. What do you think going forward, based on what you're seeing, maybe the academic sector and intelligentsia, like people's acceptance or less acceptance for the ideas of entrepreneurship and freedom?
That's a difficult one. Yes, I'm concerned about academe because I think there is a sort of political correctness and a cancel culture, which I don't think is helpful to debate. And I think you need debate for progress because you need ideas to be tried and tested and debated. And you've only got to go back to John Stuart Mill, is the most amazing defense of free speech that you've got to allow people to speak their mind and do what they want because it may be that even though you think they're wrong, that they're actually right, or they may even be a bit right, in which case it's useful. And also, in order to make sure that your own arguments are robust, you've got to be able to argue with people. And if you just simply silence everybody, then you never get to test your ideas out. They're never subjected to real criticism, and then you end up just trying to defend platitudes rather than end up trying to improve life with new ideas and beneficial improvements. So all of those things do concern me. At the same time, I think entrepreneurship is one of these things which has existed as long as the planet has existed, and entrepreneurs are always with us, and they don't need privileges. They don't need government policy to create them or to tell them how to work. All they need is the freedom to build and operate and trade. And that, I suppose, means cutting barriers to trade, and barriers to trade have come down over the decades, and I think they'll continue to come down. And I think the UK will be a big force now we're out of the European Union to campaign throughout the world. So America will have an ally there. It means welcoming new ideas, welcoming migrants, being open. And again, immigration is much more fluid in the world now than it used to be. It's much cheaper for people to move. So, that's great. New ideas infect old cultures. And I think you have to certainly reduce discrimination against minorities, women, and so on. That again allows new ideas, new people with new ideas to come into the business world. That's all happening. So that's good. But at the same time, you have to simplify your employment laws, keep your taxes down, keep your licensing regulations easy, and take on state monopolies. Well, that's a bigger problem, and there's a lot of people who don't want that to happen. But overall, I'm optimistic. I think it's the world is entrepreneurship.
All right. Thank you so much for what has been a fascinating and illuminating interview. Eamonn Butler, his book is Entrepreneurship, a Primer. It is available on Amazon. This was a joint publication between us here at the American Institute for Economic Research and our friends in Europe at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been the AIER Authors Corners podcast. Thank you.